density, I hope. I'm calling the talk The Task of Critical Theory Today, Rethinking the Critique of Capitalism and Its Futures. The far-reaching transformations of the world in recent decades have dramatically indicated that critical social analysis must be centrally concerned with questions of historical dynamics and large-scale structural changes if it is to be adequate to our social universe. And I'd argue the dynamics of those global historical processes can best be illuminated by a critical theory of capitalism. This necessarily suggests the importance of a renewed encounter with Marx's critical analysis. At the same time, however, the historical developments of the past century strongly indicate that any attempt to reappropriate Marx's critical theory must differ fundamentally from what I call traditional Marxism, a term I'll further elaborate in the course of my talk. Why should we bother rethinking Marx's analysis of capitalism? After all, the collapse of the Soviet Union and of European communism, as well as the transformation of China, have been taken by many as marking the final end of socialism and of Marx's theoretical demise, the final act, as it were, of a decades-long demise. This decline has also been expressed by the emergence of other kinds of critical theoretical approaches, such as post-structuralism or deconstruction, that seem to offer the possibility of criticizing, for example, processes of rationalization and bureaucratization in both East and West, without affirming the kinds of grand programs of human emancipation that, according to some, all too frequently have had negative historical consequences. However, these newer conceptual approaches have themselves been seriously called into question by the recent global crisis, which, in my view, have dramatically revealed their serious limitations as attempts to grasp the contemporary world. The continued eruption of severe economic crises as a feature of capitalist modernity, as well as the existence of mass poverty and structural exploitation on a global scale, suggest that, to paraphrase Mark Twain, reports of Marx's death have been greatly exaggerated. Nevertheless, it would be a mistake to think that one can simply return to Marx, as he generally was understood during much of the 20th century. Both the demise of traditional Marxism and the increasingly manifest inadequacies of much post-Marxism are rooted in historical development that suggest the need to rethink as well as reappropriate Marx. I'm suggesting then that the question of capitalism and its possible futures requires rethinking what we mean by capitalism, that a reappropriation of Marx could strongly support such an endeavor, and that a rethought critical understanding of capitalism is crucially important if we are to understand the nature of the global crisis today. As I'll elaborate in the course of this talk, contrary to the traditional interpretation, Marx's critical theory is not, on its most fundamental level, a critique of a mode of class exploitation that distorts modernity, undertaken from a standpoint that affirms labor. It also is not simply a matter of endemic structural inequality. Rather, more basically, it uncovers and analyzes a unique form of social mediation that structures modernity itself as a historically specific form of social life. This form of mediation is essentially temporal and is socially constituted by a historically unique form of labor, it manifests itself in very peculiar, quasi-objective forms of domination that cannot sufficiently be understood in terms of the domination of a class, or indeed of any concrete social and/or political entity. These forms of domination, grasped by categories of mediation such as commodity and capital, are moreover not static and cannot adequately be conceptualized in terms of the market. Rather, they're expressed by a historical dynamic that is at the very heart of capitalist modernity. Such a focus ultimately points to a fundamental rethinking of what is meant by history and temporality. Rather than considering temporality as a pre-given, unmoving frame within which all forms of social life, including capitalism, move, such a theory grasps capitalism as a very peculiar organization of social life that constitutes its own historically specific temporality. This in turn suggests that historical investigation must seek to be adequate to the temporality of its object of inquiry, rather than approaching all human societies with the same concepts of temporal processes. As I will elaborate, it also calls into question, on another level, a widespread understanding that regards approaches that emphasize temporal multiplicity to be critical, as opposed to those that emphasize singularity. My focus on the historically dynamic character of capitalist society is an attempt to respond to the massive global transformations of the past 4 decades. This period, the past 4 decades, has been characterized by the unraveling of the post-World War II state-centered Fordist synthesis in the West, the collapse or fundamental transformation of party states and their command economies in the East, and the emergence of a neoliberal capitalist global order. These developments, in turn, can be understood with reference to the overarching trajectory of state-centric capitalism in the 20th century, from its beginnings in World War I and the Russian Revolution, through its high point in the decades following World War II, and its decline after the early 1970s. What's significant about this trajectory, looking back at it, is its global character. It encompassed Western capitalist countries and communist countries, as well as colonized lands and decolonized countries. Although differences in historical developments occurred, they appear more as different inflections of a common pattern than as fundamentally different developments. For example, the welfare state expanded in all Western industrial countries in the 25 years after the end of World War II, and then was limited or partially dismantled in the early 1970s. These developments, which incidentally were paralleled by the post-war success and subsequent rapid decline of the Soviet Union and the far-going transformations of China, occurred regardless of which parties were in power. Such general developments can't be explained in terms of contingent, local, or political decisions. They imply the existence of a historical dynamic in both the East and the West that is not fully subject to political control, and that expresses general systemic imperatives and constraints on political, social, and economic decisions. Such historical transformations can also not adequately be grasped by history of politics or of identity, and they exceed the horizon of a social critique focused on distribution. They suggest the importance of a renewed encounter with Marxist critique of political economy, For the problematic of historical dynamics and global structural change is the very heart of that critique. Nevertheless, as I've suggested, the history of the last century also suggests that an adequate critical theory must differ fundamentally from traditional Marxist critiques of capitalism. What I mean by traditional Marxism is a general interpretive framework in which capitalism is analyzed essentially in terms of class relations that are rooted in private property relations and mediated by the market. Social domination is understood mainly in terms of class domination and exploitation. Within this general framework, capitalism is characterized by a growing structural contradiction, as you all know, between private property and the market, understood as the basic social relations, and the forces of production in terms of labor, especially as organized industrially. The unfolding within this framework, the unfolding of this contradiction gives rise to the possibility of a new form of society, understood in terms of collective ownership of the means of production and economic planning in an industrialized context. Within this framework, industrial production is understood as a technical process which is used by capitalists for their particularistic ends, but is intrinsically independent of capitalism and could be used for the benefit of all members of society. Within the basic framework of what I'm terming traditional Marxism, there have been a very broad range of different theoretical, methodological, and political approaches that have generated powerful economic, political, social, historical, and cultural analyses. Nevertheless, the limitations of the overarching framework itself have become increasingly evident in light of 20th century historical developments. These developments include the non-emancipatory character of actually existing socialism, the historical trajectory of its rise and decline, paralleling that of state interventionist capitalism, which suggests they were similarly situated historically, the growing importance of scientific knowledge and advanced technology in production, which seem to call into question the labor theory of value, growing criticisms of technological progress and growth, which oppose the productivism of much traditional Marxism, and the increased importance of non-class-based social identities. Together, these suggest that the traditional framework no longer can serve as an adequate point of departure for an emancipatory critical theory. Consideration of the general historical patterns that have characterized the past century, then, calls into question both traditional Marxism, with its affirmation of labor and history, as well as post-structuralist understandings of history as essentially contingent. Nevertheless, such consideration doesn't necessarily negate the critical insight informing attempts to deal with history contingently, namely that history, understood as the unfolding of an imminent necessity, delineates a form of unfreedom. Let me briefly elaborate. In the Grundrisse, Marx characterizes capitalism as a society in which individuals have much more freedom from relations of personal domination than in earlier forms of society. However, this freedom, according to Marx, is situated within the framework of a system of what he calls objective dependence, rooted in a form of social mediation that imposes quasi-objective constraints on human action. Those constraints are most tellingly manifested in the existence of a historical logic. That is, The very existence of a historical logic indicates the existence of constraints on human action. Marx then does not simply dismiss the forms of personal freedom associated with the development of capitalism, but characterizes them as fundamentally one-sided and incomplete. To consider freedom only with reference to questions of personal dependence can serve to veil the existence of a more overarching form of unfreedom, one rooted in the circumstance that people do make history, but in a form that dominates and compels them. Capitalism makes evident that people make their history even as it constrains them from doing so consciously. This form of unfreedom, I would argue, is the central object of Marx's critique of political economy, which seeks to grasp the imperatives and constraints that underlie the historical dynamics and structural changes of the modern world. His critique, then, is not undertaken from the standpoint of history and labor, as in traditional Marxism. On the contrary, the historical dynamic of capitalism, totality, the seeming ontological centrality of labor, are the objects of Marx's critique. So it should be evident that, in my reading, the critical thrust of Marx's analysis is similar in some respects to post-structuralist approaches inasmuch as it entails a critique of totality and of a dialectical logic of history. However, whereas Marx grasps such conceptions critically as expressions of the reality of capitalism, post-structuralist approaches deny their validity by insisting on the ontological primacy of contingency. Marx's critique of heteronymous history, then, differs fundamentally from that of post-structuralism inasmuch as it does not regard history as a narrative that can be dispelled discursively, but as the expression of a structure of temporal domination. From this point of view, any attempt to recover human agency by insisting on contingency in ways that deny or obscure the temporal dynamic form of domination characteristic of capital is ironically profoundly disempowering. In Marx's mature theory, then, history, in English with a capital H, understood as an immanently driven directional dynamic, is not a universal feature of human social life. Neither, however, is historical contingency. Rather, an intrinsic historical dynamic is a historically specific feature of capitalist society that can be and has been projected onto human social life in general. Far from viewing history affirmatively, Marx, by grounding this dialectical dynamic in the category of capital, grasps it as a form of heteronomy. Marx's mature theory, then, does not purport to be a transhistorically valid theory of history and social life. On the contrary, it's not historical materialism. It is emphatically and reflexively historically specific. Indeed, it calls into question any approach that claims for itself universal transhistorical validity. In order to support these contentions, what I'd like to do is briefly consider the most fundamental categories of the mature critique, such as value, commodity, surplus value, capital, and do so with reference to the heteronymous dynamic that characterizes capitalism. Within the traditional framework, Marx's category of value has been regarded as an attempt to show that direct human labor, always and everywhere, is the sole source of social wealth, which in capitalism is mediated by the market. His category of surplus value, according to such views, demonstrates the existence of exploitation by showing that in spite of appearances, the surplus product is generated by labor alone, but is appropriated by the capitalist class. Surplus value within this general framework is a category of class-based exploitation. This interpretation is at best one-sided. It's based on a transhistorical understanding of labor as an activity mediating humans and nature that is a condition of social life. Within this framework, labor is the source of wealth in all societies, but this is hindered in capitalism from becoming fully realized. So emancipation is when labor comes into its own. And this notion is bound to the idea of socialist revolution as the self-realization of the proletariat. Labor is the standpoint of the critique of capitalism. But a close reading of Marx's mature critique calls into question these transhistorical presuppositions. In the Grundrisse, which is a very useful manuscript, Marx indicates that its fundamental categories should not be understood in narrow economic terms, but as forms of social being that are at one and the same time forms of social being and social subjectivity. Moreover, the categories are historically specific to modern capitalist society. Even categories that are money, such as money and labor, that appear transhistorical because of their abstract and general character, are valid in their abstract generality only for capitalist society, according to Marx. Now, this applies to the category of value as well. In the Grundrisse, Marx explicitly treats value as a form of wealth historically specific to capitalism that is constituted by direct human labor expenditure. He distinguishes it from what he calls real wealth, which is a function of the amount of goods and depends on a variety of natural and social factors, including knowledge. Marx proceeds to outline what he calls the fundamental contradiction of capitalism as one between value and the result of its own development. The system based on value generates the historical possibility that value itself could be abolished and that production could be organized on a new basis, one not dependent on the expenditure of direct human labor in production. At the same time, however, value remains the necessary condition of capitalism. This contradiction between the potential generated by the system based on value and its actuality indicates that for Marx, the abolition of capitalism entails the abolition of value and value-creating labor. Far from signifying the self-realization of the proletariat, the abolition of capitalism would entail the self-abolition of the proletariat. And I want to suggest that this reversal is crucial when considering the crisis today. Volume 1 of Capital is the rigorous elaboration of this analysis. It begins with the category of the commodity, which refers neither to commodities as they might exist in many societies, nor to a hypothetical and non-existent pre-capitalist stage of simple commodity production. Rather, the commodity is treated by Marx as a historically specific social form that defines the core of capitalist modernity. It is both a structured form of social practice and a structuring principle of the actions, worldviews, and dispositions of people. That is, the commodity is a form both of social subjectivity and objectivity. In Capital, Marx sought to unfold the nature and underlying dynamic of capitalist modernity from this point of departure. What characterizes the commodity form of social relations as analyzed by Marx is that it is constituted by labor. This proposition is not as straightforward as it appears. Labor in capitalism, according to Marx, is marked by a historically specific dualistic character. It is both what he calls concrete labor and abstract labor. The term concrete labor doesn't refers to the fact, it does refer to the fact that some form of what we consider laboring activity mediates the interactions of humans with nature in all societies. Abstract labor, however, is a very different sort of category. It signifies that in capitalism, labor also has a unique, socially mediating function that is not intrinsic to laboring activity as such. Let me elaborate. In a society in which the commodity is the basic structuring category of the whole, labor and its products are not socially distributed by traditional norms or overt relations of power and domination, as is the case in other societies. Instead, labor itself replaces those relations by serving as a kind of a weird, quasi-objective means by which the products of others are acquired. It constitutes a new form of interdependence, where people don't consume what they produce, but where nevertheless their own labor or labor products function as a quasi-objective means of obtaining the products of others. In serving as such a means, labor and its products, in effect, preempt that function on the part of manifest social relations. They mediate a new form of social relatedness. In Marx's mature works, then, the notion of the centrality of labor to social life is not a transhistorical proposition. It does not mean that material production is the most essential dimension of social life in general, or even in capitalism. Rather, it refers to the historically specific constitution by labor in capitalism as a form of mediation that fundamentally characterizes that society. On this basis, Marx tries to socially ground basic features of modernity, such as its process of production, its overarching historical dynamic, and its basically contradictory character. Labor in capitalism, then, is both labor as we commonsensically understand it, and a historically specific socially mediating activity. So its objectifications, commodity, capital, are both concrete labor products and objectified forms of social mediation. According to this analysis, then, the social relations that most basically characterize capitalism are very different from the qualitatively specific overt social relations, such as kinship relations or relations of personal or direct domination that characterize non-capitalist societies. Although the latter kinds continue to exist, they lose their importance. What ultimately structures that society is a new underlying level of social relation constituted by labor that have a peculiar, quasi-objective, formal character and are dualistic. They are characterized by the opposition of an abstract, general, homogeneous dimension and a concrete, particular material dimension, both of which appear to be natural rather than social. Now, the abstract character of the social mediation underlying capitalism is also expressed in the form of wealth dominant in that society. As noted above, Marx's analysis of wealth is not one of wealth in general any more than it is of labor in general. His analysis of value is a historically specific form of wealth which is bound to the historically unique form of labor, capitalism. Similar to the distinction he draws in the Grundrisse, in Kapital, Marx explicitly distinguishes value from what he calls material wealth. He relates these two forms of wealth to the duality of labor and capitalism. Material wealth is measured by the quantity of products produced and is a function of a number of factors such as knowledge, social organization, and natural condition. Value is constituted solely by the expenditure of socially necessary labor time. It's the dominant form of wealth in capitalism. Whereas material wealth, when it is a dominant form, is mediated by other social relations. Value is both a form of wealth and a form of social mediation. That is, it is a self-mediating form of wealth. This self-mediating form of wealth becomes quasi-independent of the people who constitute it. The result is a historically new form of social domination, one that subjects people to impersonal, increasingly rationalized, structural imperatives and constraints that cannot adequately be grasped in terms of class domination, or more generally in terms of the concrete domination of social groupings or of institutional agencies of the state and the economy. It has no determinate locus, and although constituted by determinate forms of social practice, appears not to be social at all. I'm suggesting that Marx's analysis of abstract domination is a more rigorous and determinate analysis of what Foucault attempted to grasp with his notion of power in the modern world. Moreover, Marx's analysis reveals the one-sidedness of Foucault's notion of capillary power. The form of domination Marx analyzes is not only cellular and spatial, but, as I will elaborate, processual and temporal. It is at one and the same time capillary and overarching. I can only briefly elaborate here. Significant to the idea of a temporal pattern is Marx's determination of the magnitude of value in temporal terms. In his discussion of the magnitude of value in terms of socially necessary labor time, Marx points to a peculiarity of value as a social form of wealth whose measure is temporal. Increasing productivity increases the amount of use value produced per unit time, but it results only in short-term increases in the magnitude of value created per unit time. Once that productive increase becomes general, the magnitude of value falls to its base level. The result is a kind of a treadmill. On the one hand, increasing levels of productivity result in great increases in use value production. Yet, increased productivity does not result in long-term proportional increases in value, which is a social form of wealth in capitalism. Note that this peculiar treadmill dynamic is rooted in value's temporal dimension and not in the way the pattern is generalized, for example, through market competition. It is the first determination of a very complex, non-linear, historical dynamic that marks capitalist modernity. On the one hand, this dynamic is characterized by ongoing transformations of production and more generally of social life. On the other hand, this historical dynamic entails the ongoing reconstitution of its own fundamental condition as an unchanging feature of social life, namely that value is reconstituted, and hence that social mediation ultimately remains affected by labor, and that living labor remains integral to the process of production, regardless of the level of productivity. The historical dynamic of capitalism ceaselessly generates what is new while regenerating what is the same. It both generates the possibility of another organization of labor and of social life, and yet at the same time hinders that possibility from becoming realized. Marx's analysis of socially necessary labor time delineates a norm to which production must conform. It is the first determination of the historically specific abstract form of social domination intrinsic to capitalism's fundamental form of social mediation. It's the domination of people by time, by a historically specific form of temporality, abstract Newtonian time, which is constituted historically with the commodity form. Now, I'm certainly not the first person to point this out, but I would say that it is one-sided to view temporality in capitalism only in terms of Newtonian time, that is, as empty homogeneous time. Once capitalism is fully developed, it generates ongoing increases in productivity. These increases do not change the amount of value produced per unit time, but they do change the determination of what counts as a given unit of time. The unit of time remains constant, let's say the hour, and yet it is pushed forward, as it were. This movement, which is a very peculiar movement, is the movement of time. Hence, it cannot be apprehended within the frame of Newtonian time, but requires a superordinate frame of reference within which the frame of Newtonian time moves. This movement of time I term historical time. The redetermination of the abstract constant time unit redetermines the compulsion associated with that unit. In this way, the movement of time acquires a necessary dimension. Abstract time and historical time, then, are dialectically interrelated. Pace Lukács. Both are constituted historically with the commodity and capital forms as structures of domination. And it's at this point that Marx introduces the category of capital, which is a category of movement, its value in motion. It has no fixed form, no fixed material embodiment, but appears as different moments of its spiraling path in the form of money and commodity. Now, because of this conference, significantly in introducing the category of capital, Marx describes it in Capital with exactly the same language that Hegel used in the Phenomenology when he introduced the Geist, the self-moving substance that is the subject of its own process. In so doing, Marx suggests that a historical subject in the Hegelian sense does exist in capitalism. Hegel's notion of history as a dialectical unfolding of a subject is valid, but only for capitalist modernity. However, and this is really crucially important, Marx does not identify the subject with the proletariat or even with humanity. Instead, he identifies it with capital, a dynamic structure of abstract domination that, although constituted by humans, becomes independent of their wills. In other words, Marx's critique of Hegel, his mature critique of Hegel, no longer entails the anthropological inversion of the latter's idealist dialectic. Rather, in a curious way, it's that dialectic's materialist justification. Marx is implicitly arguing that the rational core of Hegel's dialectic is precisely its idealist character. It is an expression of a mode of domination constituted by alienated relations, that is, relations that acquire a quasi-independent existence vis-a-vis the individuals, exerts a form of compulsion on them, and that because of their peculiar dualistic character, are dialectical in character. Within my framework that I'm presenting, Marx does not posit a historical meta-subject such as the proletariat, which will realize itself in a future society, but provides a basis of a critique for such a notion. In Capital, the totality and the labor constituting it have become the objects of critique. The historical subject is the alienated structure of social mediation that is at the heart of the capitalist formation. The contradictions of capital point to the abolition, not the realization of the subject. It's significant in this regard that in the first volume, when Marx unfolds the category of capital, its relationship to the immediate producers changes. Initially, capital is no more than an alienated expression of the collective workers' labor. With what Marx calls the real subsumption of labor and the increasing importance of science and technology in production, however, capital becomes less and less the mystified form of power that actually are the powers of the workers. Rather, the social productive powers appropriated by capital increasingly become socially general productive powers that no longer can be understood as those of the immediate producers. This accumulation of socially general knowledge renders value, and hence proletarian labor, increasingly anachronistic. At the same time, the dialectic of value and use value reconstitutes value and the necessity of such labor. Capitalism's development opens up the possibility that proletarian labor could be abolished. At the same time, it constrains the realization of that possibility. One implication of this analysis is that capital does not exist as a unitary totality, and that the Marxian notion of the dialectical contradiction between what he calls sometimes forces and relations of production does not refer to a contradiction between relations that are intrinsically capitalist of market and private property, and forces that purportedly are extrinsic to capital, labor. Rather, the contradiction is intrinsic to capital itself. So as a contradictory totality, capital is generative of a dynamic that points to the possibility of its own overcoming. This approach, and now I have to really compress, provides a basis for a critical analysis of the structure of social labor and the nature of production in capitalism. It argues that the industrial proletarian-based process of production is not a technical process that is capitalist only if owned privately. Rather, the mode of producing is itself intrinsically capitalist. This is consistent with Marx's larger analysis. Capital's dialectic of transformation and reconstitution, although based on a treadmill dialectic, has directionality. Marx argues this in his chapter on accumulation, in which he shows that capitalism's drive for increasing productivity generates a secular tendency towards increasing the proportion of constant capital, which expresses objectified science and technology, relative to variable capital, to living labor. One result is the ongoing constitution by capital of an increasingly unequal social division of time between those who are overworked and those who are under or unemployed, the so-called industrial reserve army of labor. Now, this analysis traditionally has been taken as a critique of capitalism's inability to provide full employment. This reading, however, in my view, misses the thrust of Marx's argument and its relevance for today's crisis. Marx's chapter on accumulation should be read as the culmination of the following arguments. Capital's drive for ongoing increases in productivity gives rise to a technologically sophisticated productive apparatus that renders the production of material wealth essentially independent of direct human labor time expenditure. This opens the possibility of large-scale, socially general reductions in labor time and fundamental changes in the nature and social organization of labor. Yet these possibilities are not realized in capitalism. Instead, value is reconstituted as the foundation of the system. Consequently, although there is a growing shift away from manual labor, the development of technologically sophisticated production does not liberate most people from fragmented and repetitive labor. Similarly, labor time is not reduced on a socially general level, but is distributed unequally, even increasing for many. On the one hand, the species' capacities constituted historically in the form of capital open up the historical possibility of a future form of social production that no longer is based on the expenditure of direct human labor and production, that is, on the labor of a class. On the other hand, the necessity of the present is constantly reconstituted, and yet that necessity becomes increasingly anachronistic. The combination of the ongoing reconstitution of the necessity of value-creating labor, i.e., proletarian labor, and its increasingly anachronistic character increasingly generates superfluous labor. This opens up the possibility of a general reduction in labor time and even points beyond itself to the historical possibility of the abolition of proletarian labor. Far from appearing as a linear possibility, the possibility of the abolition of proletarian labor, and hence the abolition of class society, appears in an inverted, opaque form as a threat. The duality of capitalism's dynamic generates this possibility, whereby superfluous labor now appears to be a marker of superfluous people. So the approach that I'm trying to outline reconceptualizes post-capitalist society in terms of the overcoming of the proletariat and the labor it does. That is, in terms of a transformation of the general structure of labor and time. In a sense, it differs both from the traditional Marxist notion of the realization of the proletariat and from the capitalist mode of abolishing working classes by creating an underclass within the framework of the unequal distribution of labor and time nationally and globally. The possibility of the future, one in which surplus production no longer must be based on the labor of an oppressed class, is at the same time the possibility of a disastrous development, one in which the growing superfluity of labor is expressed as the growing superfluity of people. The possibility of liberation, of the liberation of humans, both from and through history, appears in a form such that the category of human appears as a problem for humanity. The contradiction allowing for another form of life, however, also allows for the possibility of imagining another form of life. That is, the theory grounds the possibility of itself by means of the same categories with which it grasps its object. The problem of economic growth and capitalism within this framework is not only that it is crisis-ridden, but rather that the form of growth itself is problematic. The trajectory of growth would be very different according to this approach if the ultimate goal of production were increased quantities of material wealth rather than of surplus value. According to the reinterpretation I'm trying to outline, Marx's critical theory extends far beyond the traditional critique of bourgeois relations of distribution, the market private property class. It is not only a critique of exploitation and the unequal distribution of wealth and power, rather it grasps modern industrial society itself as capitalist and critically capitalizes capitalism primarily in terms of abstract structures of domination, increasing fragmentation of individual labor and individual existence, and blind runaway developmental logic. It treats the working class as the basic element of capitalism, rather than as the embodiment of its negation, and implicitly conceptualizes socialism in terms of the possible abolition of the proletariat and of the organization of production based on proletarian labor, as well as the abolition of the dynamic system of abstract compulsions constituted by labor as a socially mediating activity. By shifting the focus of the critique away from an exclusive concern with the market and private property, this approach could provide, retrospectively, the basis for a critical theory of the so-called actually existing socialist countries as alternative and failed forms of capital accumulation, rather than as social modes that represented the historical negation of capital in however imperfect a form. It opens the possibility for a theory that could reflect historically on the new social movements of recent decades and the sorts of historically constituted worldviews they embody and express. It might also be able to approach the global rise of forms of what we call fundamentalisms as populist, fetishized forms of opposition to the differential effects of neoliberal global capitalism. Now, it's become evident, considered retrospectively, that the social, political, economic, cultural configuration of capitalist hegemony has varied historically from mercantilism through 19th century liberal capitalism, 20th century state-centric Fordist capitalism, to contemporary neoliberal global capitalism. Each configuration has elicited a number of penetrating critiques of exploitation and uneven, inequitable growth, for example, or of technocratic, bureaucratic modes of domination. Each of these critiques, however, is incomplete. As we now see, capitalism cannot be identified fully with any of its historical configurations. I've sought to differentiate between approaches that, however sophisticated, ultimately are critiques of one historical configuration of capital, and an approach that allows for an understanding of capital as the core of the social formation, separable from its various surface configurations. This distinction between capital as the core of the social formation and historically specific configurations of capitalism has become increasingly important. Conflating the two has resulted in significant misrecognitions. Recall Marx's assertion that the coming social revolution must draw its poetry from the future, unlike earlier revolutions that focused on the past, misrecognized their own historical content. In that light, what I'm calling traditional Marxism backed into a future it did not grasp. Rather than pointing to the overcoming of capitalism, it entailed a misrecognition that focusing on private ownership in the market conflated capital and its 19th century configuration. I think we're moving back there. Consequently, it implicitly affirmed the new state-centric configuration that emerged out of the crisis of liberal capitalism. The unintended affirmation of a new configuration of capitalism can be seen more recently in the anti-Hegelian turn to Nietzsche, characteristic of much post-structuralist thought since the early 1970s. Such thought arguably also backed into a future it didn't adequately grasp. In rejecting the sort of state-centric order traditional Marxism implicitly affirmed, it did so in a manner that was, I think, incapable of critically grasping the neoliberal global order that has superseded state-centric capitalism east and west. The historical transformations of the past century, then, have not only revealed the weakness of much traditional Marxism, as well as of various forms of critical post-Marxism, but also suggests the central significance of a critique of capitalism for an adequate critical theory today. What makes this project particularly difficult, both theoretically and politically, is that the critique of capitalism today is the critique not of a stable social formation, but of the core of the social formation that is in the process of pointing beyond itself. I'm suggesting then that the secular tendency of value-producing labor, the current crisis of work, will become broader and deeper, and that the present phase and the crisis of financialization are two sides of the same coin. And this crisis is far more profound and international than the sort of earlier, more national cycles of financialization that, for example, Giovanni Arrighi outlined in the long 20th century. This could help clarify why the widespread desire by so many on the left to return to the social democratic Fordism of the post-war decades is historically a losing proposition, and why neoliberalism seems to be remaining hegemonic regardless of the shadow of the Great Recession. In short, by attempting to rethink Marx's conception of capital as the essential core of the social formation, I'm trying to contribute to the reconstitution of a robust critique of capitalism today that, freed from the conceptual shackles of approaches that identify capitalism with one of its historical configurations, could potentially be adequate to our social universe. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. And
a little long, I apologize.
Find out once more the irony that this conference is taking place in the business building of this campus, and that this room is the Bank of America room. So, any questions, any comments?
Thank you. Fellow Hyde Parker here. Thank you for a talk that's going to take me a very long time to absorb. But I just want to see if I've extrapolated. It's not the language I normally use to critique Marxist thinking, but let me see if I can absorb some of the implications of what you're saying, that maybe not the last stage of capitalism, but maybe a latter stage of capitalism might be under the, is it fair to think of it under the category of the production of superfluousness, that a combination of the superfluousness of products that we don't need and can't use, of people we don't need and can't use, of what we were talking about in this conference of capital that the capitalists don't know what to do with because they've got capital that's superfluous because it's a force that no longer produces anything, so it's superfluous. So in a certain way, under the shadow of superfluousness in this latter stage, we recognize in a deeply corrupted form the possibility of our own freedom, which of course is a kind of superfluous turned upon itself into being what we could possibly be without necessity.
I think that's very well put. I like that a lot. And I was trying to begin to try to get at that within the framework I'm presenting, superfluous is both, opens up the possibility of emancipation and opens up the possibility of a disaster. And I think the double-sidedness of the word superfluous really captures that. And it seems to me that critical theorists should be trying to focus on this kind of category rather than to return to a framework that I believe really historically has been shown to be anachronistic, a more productivist framework. But I think it's a very difficult undertaking. And it's certainly not only theoretically difficult, I think politically it poses enormous problems. But thank you very much for that. Hi, Lauren.
At the very end of the discussion, you brought in financialization. Marx first brought the concept in Volume 3 of Capital, but one of the questions that comes up at the end of your very profound illumination is the extent that we have a situation now with the majority of wealth, not value, but wealth that's being produced through financialization. The other side of that is that the growing class today is not a working class, is a precarious class of people that East Standing is described as a dangerous class because they have no connection to labor, no connection to organized work, etc., etc. So how do we update our thinking of the issues that you raised, which focus primarily on labor and the temporality of labor, with the fact that very often financial transactions are bought, stocks and currencies are bought and sold, and within nanoseconds, because sometimes stocks are held 20 minutes, they'll rise 1/10 of 1%, but the computer will exchange them so rapidly that even if they only go up 1/10 of 1%, when you buy $1 billion worth of something, that's real money. So how would you basically look at the move toward financialization? And the figure that I like to use is that 42% of the profits made in the United States now come from the financial industries. I'll talk to you later.
I don't know that I can give a really full answer to that, Lauren. It does seem to me that it is, as one would say 3 generations ago in a party school, it is no accident that the equations that are really central to financialization were developed in 1973, 1974. It seems to me that precisely when the Fordist mode, which was a productivist mode and seemed to be for many people, the one with which we had the least conceptual difficulties, when it ran up against its limits, you began to get this move to financialization. The real question in this regard is whether, and there are countless debates about this, is this fictive wealth or is it real wealth? And it's usually dealt with in a manner that I find too immediate. That is, you go to value right away and then you say, no, value can't explain this. Whereas what Marx is trying to do with the value theory is to explain this whole movement. So then the question would be, is value still valid? Not in the sense that if you don't have people building widgets, the society is poor. But is the theory going to explain this turn to financialization? And if it does, then that would be an indication that this financialization actually is generative of fictional wealth. And that therefore, no matter how high the stock market is going, the society is going to be poorer. And for me, this is a research question rather than one that I can pronounce on right now. But it seems to me that would be the way to go.
Hello. My question concerns praxis.
Okay.
I read your book many years ago, and it strikes me that the strength of traditional Marxism, one of its strengths was that it was clearly associated with a definite praxis. Form working class parties, win elections if you're in the West, seize state power in Russia and China and so on. But it's not so clear what the praxis implication is of Marxism-Postonism. And so I would just welcome any comments that you have, any suggestions as to how to put your critique into practice.
It's a problem as far as I'm concerned. It's always been a problem. I agree completely with you that a very strong advantage of traditional Marxism is that there was a kind of a continuum between, let's say, everyday working class organization to more radical forms. That there, I mean, although it was debated as reform versus revolution, etc., nevertheless, there was a strong possibility of conceptual continuum, which we don't have today. I agree with that completely, and I wish that I had a better answer, but it does seem to me that it is incumbent upon us to be as sober as we can be about the situation that we face. I mean, I have very good friends who insist that neoliberal globalization is simply giving rise to a larger and larger global working class, which in part is effected at the expense of the well-being of the Western European and North American working classes. But what we're going to get is finally the world proletariat as foreseen in 1848. And I think empirically that's wrong. From everything I know, that's just simply wrong. Even the size of the Chinese working class, according to figures that I've looked at, stopped growing around 2004. And if that's the situation, we are faced, I think, with a dilemma. And that's in part what I was trying to allude to when I said that we're now dealing with a social formation that is also pointing beyond itself. And I'm very sorry. I wish I had better responses to some of these questions, because I think the questions are extremely important and have to be followed through.
Okay, I think we'll have one more question. The connection also seems to be breaking up a bit, so maybe a good idea to get close to the end of the session. Hans Backer?
Hello, I'm Hans Backer.
Hi.
Good to hear your talk. Enjoyed it. I want to play with the idea of the historically specific versus the trans-historical, and ask you if you recognize a third category. Usually when we say historically specific, we think in terms of a relatively short period of time. Let's say a few years, a decade perhaps at the most. But capitalism has existed in one form or another, modern capitalism, since perhaps around the 16th century or 17th century. So that's more than a decade.
Yes.
Now, the distinction that you made is only two categories, and I wonder if you would recognize that third category, a kind of neo-Weberian 400-year-long period that is neither trans-historical nor historically specific in the sense in which we usually use that term.
What would be, so that I understand the question better, what would be the purchose of that third category?
Well, to understand what you're saying in terms of capitalism not being trans-historical, that many of the phrases that have been interpreted in Capital and in the Grundrisse and other writings as being trans-historical actually refer to a limited 300, 400, 500-year period. Maybe you can even make it 200 years or whatever you want to make it, the emergence of the world capitalist system or something. But quite different from the latest trend reported in the latest Wall Street Journal article or on MSNBC.
Correct, and that's what I was trying to do toward the end when I said the category of capital has been at the heart of differing formations. It seems to me that one of the things that Marx is getting at is that capitalism, once it appears in the world, delineates a break with the way in which humans have reproduced themselves that is so profound that that in comparison to capitalism, it's legitimate to use the term non- or pre-capitalist for a whole variety of social organizations that actually are quite heterogeneous. But compared to capitalism, they have something, they're all different from capitalism. And so that capitalism, I think for Marx, is really a new epoch in the ways in which the humans reproduce themselves. But it takes centuries to really come into its own. So I take the word capitalism to be an analytic category for what otherwise we would call modernity.
Yes, but you didn't get at my question. Capitalism over 400 years has changed a lot. And the capitalism of 1800 in the UK is different from the capitalism of 21st century in the Republic of China.
I agree.
They're similar. So are you referring to historically specific in the sense of limited periods of history, or are you referring to historically specific as the last 400 years of modern capitalism? I
would tend more to the latter.
And do you recognize that smaller category as important for critical theory analysis?
Yes, but it seems to me that that category then involves what is also, I think, a very important area of research, which is the relationship of what I would deem to be the underlying categories, value, capital, etc., and the very different historical configurations in which capitalism has existed. And for that, we would need those shorter-term categories as well.
Thank you very much.
Okay.
Good. Thank you very much. So,
thank you, Harry.